Want to talk a little bit about the whole nature of people who just follow the crowd. Now, there's a few subjects, few issues I want to encompass in this because they're interrelated. But my whole life, I've had a problem with that sort of mentality, and I don't want to come across here as self-righteous. I have plenty of faults, right? I sometimes have a quick temper. I procrastinate. And there's a lot of subjects I need to inform myself on that I'm not as informed as I would like to be. Um, there's things about my life I know I can improve, so I definitely don't want to come across as holier than thou. I have many flaws, I really do. But speaking candidly, this character trait in someone is something I find hard to accept. So let me explain a little bit what I mean by this. Following the crowd, sheep, to use sort of derogatory um, description of people who do this. And I'll be completely honest, I have called people sheep when I don't respect the sort of way that they are following the crowd. But there's this very specific problem with this. If someone isn't thinking for themselves because they maybe don't know a subject, or they just want to go along with things because that's easier. I'm not talking about that. I mean, easier in terms of, they don't want to be put on the spot because maybe they don't know the details of the subject. But I'm talking specifically about situations like bullying, exploitation, and going with the crowd because it is easier than doing the right thing. That is a sort of cowardice that I have no respect for. Now, in some circumstances, there really is no choice. If you live in a totalitarian or even authoritarian state, where speaking out can get you killed or imprisoned, then keeping a low profile, I think, is understandable, or even putting on a pretense of kind of going with the crowd. And I'll give an example of this. I have known Thai dissidents who have had to kind of put on a pretense of being really sycophantically pro royalist, because to not do that in a country like Thailand, they would risk being charged with lèse majesté, facing 15 years in jail, and being subject to mob wrath. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. I personally know people who've been through this. There's other situations where people have to, step in line because to not do so would risk death, torture, imprisonment. So I'm not talking here about situations where people need to protect themselves or their families by putting on a front. There's times indeed when lies can save someone's life. So that's really not what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about situations where it's in relatively free societies where people just follow the crowd because they they just lack any sort of critical thinking. And I'll give an example of this: the Jeremy Kyle show. I've been very outspoken about that. When I see the mentality of his supporters, my first thought is sheep. I I find that his supporters, after a few sort of choreographed lines that they come out with, oh, what about Love Island? Oh, Jeremy hasn't done anything wrong. Oh, that man killed himself. Whatever the excuse is, when you dig beneath the surface, they have no answers. I find they tend not be very intelligent. And, this is not a snobby thing. This isn't sort of a class thing like, oh, they all need to be studying Plato or something. It's not like that. But there's just a basic lack of intelligence in terms of coming up with reasoned argument. Okay, that's not a snobby thing. That's just an observation that they just can't seem to do that. They cannot seem to come up with a reasonable argument to justify that show. So that would be an example. And the reason I find it very hard to have any respect for such people is because I do think the show was based on exploitation and bullying, as the parliamentary committee showed. There's things that we didn't even know about before, like the serious flaws of the lie detector test and the way that guests were misled on the application forms, the way that guests who may have had a problem were not given really any proper avenue except to be loosely diverted to Ofcom. I think it was Ofcom, yeah. But you can apply this in other situations. When we talk about bullying in schools or in the workplace, one mistake that is often made in terms of the popular depiction of bullying is it's always this notion that it's one big guy or big girl who's the bully and they're picking on other people. Far more often than not, actually, bullying involves a group of people. It could be a gang or it could just be a collective thing. That sort of bullying, in my own personal experience and from what I've observed, is far more common than the comic book stereotype of some big 6 foot guy with a knuckle duster or something. That's very much a caricature bully. I'm not saying that sort of bully doesn't exist, but I think a far more common bully is an unimposing bully. Sometimes quite physically weak people who are actually in a group, and that is horrible. When you get a group of people targeting one individual, this happens in schools, it happens in workplaces, it happens in the armed forces. It really is something that plagues all of our society and indeed across the world. It's a horrible thing. It really ruin people's lives. Um, because someone in that position, you can say, "Oh, just stand up to them." Well, that could cause more problems. If they're passive, that causes more problems. The onus should never be on the victim to do this or do that. The fault lies 100% with the bullies, and that's something that we need to drop the laptop. There. That's something that we need to accept. Um, so I find it very hard to keep my cool with this sort of mentality. Be quite honest about that. I find it very hard to not feel disgust, quite frankly, at those sort of people. People who cannot see that something is clearly wrong. Now, okay, that's subjective. Some people will, you might say what's right and what's wrong, but certain obvious things are wrong. Exploitation is obviously wrong. Um, and very often tied in with this lack of intelligence is this tendency to look up to a cult figure. Jeremy Kyle's sort of a cult figure within the context of his show, because Kyle fans are totally blind to his many faults. And when they look up to Jeremy, the thing is, Kyle isn't stupid. I think he's quite smart. I mean, he's smart enough to have had this going for 14 years. I think he's very manipulative. I think he's a very cynical, devious, Machiavellian character. One could joke he'd make a great politician. He's almost like a reality TV version of Francis Underwood of House of Cards. He's a very devious figure. And what I find unfortunate about Kyle fans, I mean, I've no doubt that he has genuinely helped some people, but the thing there is, it's almost like dictators. Dictators have to have some redeeming qualities in order to stay in power. Kyle's show went for 14 years. If it was all resulting in negative incidents, the show probably would have been scrapped years ago. But there was just enough redeeming qualities to keep it afloat. Not justified in my view, but that's that. So I really have no respect for that sort of cowardice, and that's what I call it, following the crowd. It is absolutely disgusting because the victim, the person, whether it be the bullying victim, whether it be the person exploited, whoever it is, who's on the receiving end of that, it's a David and Goliath situation. It's not fair. You wouldn't have a boxing match where one guy was taking on three guys. No, it's one on one. With this dynamic of people who follow the crowd, it's a mob against one person. And I'm not saying that the guests were, I'm not coming from a really liberal perspective. Some of those guests were pretty unpleasant people, which poses the question, why weren't they in a court of law? Why weren't they charged with the things that Kyle was dragging them up for instead of him paying them to appear on the show? The number of contradictions that come with this is just pathetic. Um, so I think that the reality is this: most people just want to get on with their lives. They're doing the job. They're just trying to get by, and that's totally understandable. But because of that, the sort of people that I'm talking about, they don't really care about the facts. They don't really care about right and wrong. They have the strength of numbers, and that to me is unforgivable cowardice. I'm not saying that everyone needs to be a hero. I'm not saying that everyone needs to be a social justice warrior. I mean that term actually is an interesting one to analyze. But anyway, not everyone is a righteous figure. I would argue no one is, because even the great righteous figures all had their faults. Martin Luther King had his faults. Nelson Mandela had his faults. Everyone does. Everyone. And when people get into personality cults, I mean, notwithstanding the fact you get admirable people, but when people get into this mentality that someone is above reproach, and this is a mentality that Kyle fans have with him, that's dangerous. And when you combine that with low intelligence and playing to the lowest common denominator, I mean, this is how dictators rise to power. And it's just, and I'm going to say this, I think a lot of Trump supporters, I don't believe they're necessarily racist. I don't believe they're necessarily bad people. But I do think that people who are taken in by Trump's sound bites are clearly not really thinking through the issues. I'll build a big, beautiful wall. I can understand people on border states who have real anxieties and so on, but I do think that there are a lot of Trump supporters, and you can apply this to other politicians, other political figures, who are taken in by sound bites and they will not look through a given issue. I really do believe that's the case. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're bad people, but it does mean that they're not thinking for themselves. And I find that very troubling. Let me know your thoughts.